let's move to the next motive where that drive controls. Okay. And that's social cognition. So social cognition is how you think about yourself, how you think about the social world. It's thinking about people around you. It's how we end up sort of attending to, selecting, how we interpret and remember social information, and how we use that information to make judgments and decisions. And so being in a situation, you look around yourself and you say, well, this is how I'm interpreting this, and this is how I'm going to act based off of that. And so what this really is it takes into account how people think about the world. And it kind of puts people as like amateur sleuths, like we're not sort of passively moving through our environment. We're actively trying to understand our world, actively being able to try to predict what's going to go on. Some people are better than others with the social cognition. But the idea is that we're all sort of trying to understand what's going on around us. And so the more accurate we can understand what's going on, the more effective our judgments and decisions can be. But we make mistakes all the time. And we really typically act on the basis of completely inaccurate information and inaccurate interpretations. But again, we're trying our best. And so the world around us has a lot of information and a lot of things going on at once. So what we have to do is work really quickly to navigate our environment. So if we had to sit and think about every little tiny thing, then we would not get anywhere and we would probably all die. Because, like a bear runs in the room, it's like, oh, what are we going to do? Let me think. Oh, there's a bear in the room. Oh, there's a door. There's a wall. And if you start breaking everything down in the situation, the bear is going to eat you. Whereas if you're like, oh, I'm going to get the hell up out of here because there's a bear, that's a really quick cognition and you can act on that. So being able to navigate our environment quickly sometimes comes at the cost of misinterpreting what's going on around us. And I think that we have all been in situations where we've misinterpreted situations because we're tired or because we're not paying attention, and somebody says something and it kind of sort of triggers a thought or behavior, and we react incorrectly because maybe we misheard that person or misinterpreted what they meant by that. And that usually happens when we're not paying attention or we got too much stuff going on around us. Another thing that certainly impacts our interpretation of the world around us is how we expect people to act, how we expect people reacting to us, how we expect situations to go. All of these things can actually change the nature of our social world. The self-fulfilling prophecy is a really, really great example of this. And so this is where you have an expectation that someone's going to act a certain way. And that expectation changes the way that you behave toward them. And then they react to you in the way that you expect because of the way that you presented yourself. So basically, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You had an expectation about a way somebody was going to act, and they fulfilled that because of the way that you treated them. One of the examples is this, and we're going to talk about this in more detail later on in the class. Is a really interesting example where teachers were giving lists of students. And so the students were in order, and they were told that they were in order of how successful they were going to be, like how they call them like early bloomers and late bloomers. Okay. And so the late bloomers were the ones who were at the bottom of the list, and they were like, okay, they're not going to probably perform well because they're ranked really low on this list. And so what ended up happening was that list was completely random. And the teachers didn't know that. They thought that the top kids were the best kids and the bottom kids were the worst kids. And it was a completely random list of names. And so what ended up happening was at the end of the year, those students who were at the top of the list, regardless of their ability, regardless of how they scored on tests or whatever, were all top of the class. And those kids that were at the bottom of the class, even if they were the smartest kid in the class, did the worst. And that's because that the teachers actually changed the way that they reacted to the students. If they felt like they were going to perform really well, they paid more attention to them. They listened to them, gave them more respect, called on them more often in class, encouraged them. They tried to give them more challenging material. Okay. Those kids were happier. They felt more respected. They ended up being smarter and more motivated because of the attention that was given to them. Whereas the kids at the bottom of the list, and some of those kids were actually some of the best performing kids that would have probably naturally been top of the class, were at the bottom because they weren't given the attention. They weren't given the extra sort of help. They were expected to fail. They were expected to do poorly. And that was a self-fulfilling prophecy. They ended up performing exactly how the teachers expected because of the way that the teachers acted in the classroom towards those students. So how you act around people around you can impact how they respond to you, and that can change relationships. Okay. That can change people based off of what you expect of them. And we're going to, like I said, we're going to get into a whole section of this later on in the semester. So if you were like, oh, that's really interesting, I'd like to learn more, we will absolutely learn more. And some other additional motives that we're not really going to get into super detail, but obviously there's a lot of things that go into us interpreting our situation. So biology is important. There's biological drives. If we're hungry, sometimes we interpret the situation incorrectly. I get hangry. I don't know about y'all, but there are biological motives that can change how we view things around us. We have a desire for, being rewarded and being reinforced, and that can change how you view situations, as well as being able to be in control of the situation, being in control of yourself, having autonomy. All of these things can impact how you view situations as well. So don't ever underestimate how important social influence is. Social influence is one of those things where we really need to think about how we expect certain people to behave and how we behave, and then how we think about what's going on and what our interpretation is can impact a lot of things around us. Okay. So one really good example of the power of social influence is the fundamental attribution error. And what this is this is a way for us to feel better about ourselves, because we have a tendency to explain our behavior as situational, and we explain other people's behavior as personality. Okay. So I'll give you guys an example. Have you ever been driving down the street or riding with somebody, and there's nobody in front of you, there's nobody behind you, you're just puttering along, you're just driving down the street, and then out of nowhere, this car is looks like they're about to pull out in front of you, and you're like, don't do it. Don't do it. There's nobody behind me. Just wait a minute. And then boom, they pull out right in front of you. And then you got to slam the brakes or get in the other lane. What are you going to say about that person? So what's the first thought that comes to your mind that you're going to be about this person? Okay. You might call them a name. You might insult them. You might say, screw you, right? You might have expletives. What are some things are you going to think about that person? Because it's exactly what we do. Okay. We're so what are rude, impatient? What are these things? They're personality traits, right? You have taken their behavior and you've explained it in a way that is based on who they are as a person, rooted in that person. So you would say they're impatient, they're rude, they don't know how to drive, they should get their license taken away. They're an idiot, right? These are all personality traits. These are all traits in the person that you have blamed their behavior on, of pulling out in front of you. You've just blamed all of their personality based about, rooted in their personality. You've never seen that person before. You've never met that person before, but they are rude and impatient and a jerk for jumping out in front of you. Now, be honest. You ever jump out in front of anybody when you're driving? You ever be puttering down the road and then you pull out in front of somebody and you're like, oh, that was a little close. Of course, not on purpose. I'm saying you just what would be your explanation? So what if you pulled out in front of somebody and you're like, oh, okay, maybe. Yeah. So what would you say about yourself? What would you say about a situation? And you're like, okay, what would be the thing that comes to mind that if I'm like, why did you do that? Why did you pull out in front of that person? And you say, I didn't do it on purpose. Okay, well, why did you do it? Okay, I got one. I didn't see them. Okay, what else? Had to be somewhere. You were in a hurry. You thought you had enough time. You thought you had enough space. What else? You're running late. Yep. Got to get somewhere. Okay, so somebody did say this, but up until this point, to the last one that said impatient. Okay, you're being impatient now. Are you an impatient person or were you just impatient in that moment? Because every single excuse that's been given so far has been situational. None of it has been blaming a personality trait. Nobody said, oh, I pulled out. It's in that moment. You're impatient in that moment. You're not an impatient person. You were just impatient right then. All of these things are not personality factors. These are all situational factors. Nobody said, oh, I'm a jerk. I'm rude. I don't know how to drive. Nobody said that, because that is not how we explain our behavior. We explain our behavior based off of, oh, oops, there was a bush in the way. I thought I had more time. It was an accident. I didn't mean to. Nobody explained their behavior by saying I'm an awful person. But you're very quick to explain other people's exact same behavior as a personality trait, right? As a personality flaw. So nobody says, oh, they were probably just in a hurry, or maybe they were distracted, or maybe nobody explains behavior that way. That's the fundamental attribution error. Okay. It is a fundamental error to blame behavior on a person's attribute, their traits. Okay. When it could have absolutely been situational factors. And we discount those situational factors. So we ignore social influence. We ignore what's going on to make ourselves feel better. And as you start to realize that we do this naturally, you're going to start catching yourself. And so how do we not make this error? Well, we say, well, why did that person pull out in front of us? Maybe it's not that they're rude or a bad driver, but maybe they didn't see me, or maybe they're in a hurry, or maybe they were distracted. Okay. And sometimes maybe they are a jerk. Okay. But if our first reaction is to blame an attribute, okay, when it's not the same reaction for our own behavior, that's an error, right? Does everybody see how that works? And we're going to talk more about that, but that's kind of a insight into some of the things that we tend to do. Okay. Now, what happens when we make this mistake? What happens when we try to blame people for behaviors like if they are in a cult, and let's say everybody in the cult like kills themselves? Okay. What do we say about those people? Oh, they were just, they were sheep. They followed that person. They all had problems. They were crazy. What happens when you see a shooting on TV? What happens when somebody, hurts somebody else or shoots children at a school? What are the things that we say? Oh, they're mentally unstable. They're crazy. We start to blame these attributes without understanding social influence, without understanding the situational factors that could have put them in that position. Because honestly, we are all in positions where there are certain factors that can change our behaviors in a way that will make us do egregious things, right? There are always things that we can think of that if the situation were as bad as it could get, literally as bad as it could get, that we might be capable of doing some egregious act. We don't like thinking about that. That's the reason why we don't do this. That's why we make the fundamental attribution error. When we underestimate social influence, we do gain this feeling of security, but it's a false sense of security because we ignore the fact that that person who went into their job and shot someone, well, maybe they were, and I'm not excusing behavior. I'm just saying we need to look at some of these situational factors to understand the behavior. Maybe they lost everything, literally. Maybe maybe their spouse died. Maybe their house burned down. Maybe they lost their job. Maybe all of those things happen. Maybe they're homeless. Maybe they're terminally ill. We don't know unless we ask the question. Instead of just saying, oh, that person is crazy or that person's unstable, instead of blaming it on some kind of attribute of, oh, that person's just a jerk or they're evil. Okay. And that's our first inclination, to always go to that person's flawed. Okay. That is lowering our guard, because then we as a people stop realizing that we all have situational factors that can drive our behavior as well. And so we always have to kind of keep that in mind and not underestimate the social influence and what's going on around us and what's influencing our behavior. And also, this is a way for us to oversimplify really complex situations. And when we do that, we really are not appreciating the power of the situational factors. We also don't understand the actual true causes for that behavior if we just write that person off as being, messed up or evil or flawed, instead of saying, okay, well, you know what, let's understand what that person's going through and how they interpreted their own situation, so that maybe we can help other people in the future who are in similar situations. Okay. We also tend to realize that tend to not realize that sometimes even really minor situational factors can have some really powerful effects and can overwhelm personality traits and differences. And so a person might be kind, nice, and patient, but then when there are situational factors that are in place, like you're running late or you're in emergency, you might act differently. Okay. We have lots of examples where people are kind of, especially right now, where people are acting kind of mean and unkind and sort of wild out in public. Well, why are they acting that way? Okay. Well, we're in the middle of a pandemic. People are isolated. People are depressed. People are at their end. People have lost their jobs. They've lost loved ones. I'm not justifying their behavior and saying that there's a right that they should act that way. You see people, for example, losing it at restaurants and stores. And I'm not saying that's justified, because they absolutely shouldn't act that way. But we don't know, that person might be the nicest person ever, but just those situational factors has impacted the way that they've kind of met their wits end. And every single one of us has basically has a final straw. We all have a limit. We all have a threshold. And then when that threshold's been met, then that's going to change how we act and how we see the world around us. Okay. So remember that we are constantly trying to interpret things. And in some case, we interpret things incorrectly, we misinterpret things. And how we behave in given situations is not necessarily determined by objective factors and objective conditions, but how we view that. So for example, a person might be in a situation where they think that their partner's cheating on them. And so that causes them to act a certain way. It doesn't matter what's actually happening objectively, whether the person is or isn't cheating. What happens is how that person's interpreting the world around them. And they're seeing things that may or may not be signs that their partner's cheating. That's going to impact how they behave to other people and to their partner. Okay, so as social psychologists, okay, you want to be able to apply the research that you're doing and the conclusions that you're making. You want to be able to apply that to the real world. Now, in some cases, we ask, why do we even study social influence? Well, sometimes it's just the answer is we're curious. We have a question and we want to answer that question. But then a lot of times, social psychologists are able to contribute a solution to a social problem. So for example, studying prejudice can help us understand how to get people to stop being prejudiced, how to stop stereotypical behavior, or engaging in thoughts about how people are stereotyped. We can talk about how to do programs so that people are less biased when we understand the underlying factors of construals and how people interpret the world around them. We can also do things like reduce, we can actually tackle energy shortages by influencing how people look at their energy bill. And we're going to talk about this later, and actually influence how people use electricity, and that can impact energy shortages. And there's a really interesting thing, sort of set of studies that we'll talk about later. AIDS and how to reduce AIDS and unsafe sex practices You can absolutely see how people react to different advertisements. For example, if you scare people too much, if you say, oh, if you have unprotected sex, you're definitely going to get this horrible disease and you're going to die. Well, that's too intense and too scary. And so people will almost kind of flip the script and decide, oh, that's not me, that I can't, that doesn't involve me. I'm exempt from that. And so then continue to engage in unsafe practices, looking at unhealthy habits like smoking and drinking excessively, things like that. And also things like violence in schools and trying to combat bullying. All of these things can actually be studied through a social psychology perspective and lens, and then we can get solutions to some of these problems. I've got a comment here. I just noticed this. They are a product of their environment, and I think I missed when you put that. But I think that was probably back when we were talking about how people react in certain situations. For example, if it's like somebody's doing this egregious act. So I would kind of argue a little bit. They are a product of their environment, but it's more of like you're a product of how you view your environment. So, your environment can mean a lot of different things, but it's how you perceive your environment that's important in this case. Um, Other things that social psychologists can really get at is looking at things like violence. And so trying to understand if children who watch violent TV become more violent because they're watching violent TV, or is it other factors in their environment? So are they drawn to violent television because they're exposed to violence in the home, for example? What kind of intervention can help reduce aggression in cases where children are being more aggressive, right? So how can we reduce that aggression? When we are looking at solutions for problems, we have to think about things that are rooted in empirical work. We have to think about, okay, this intervention has to have actual evidence and information that has shown that it's successful. And we have to actually collect data to make sure that that's the case. So anytime there's an intervention that's recommended, it has to be grounded in scientific theory and in actual scientific method. This is a nice review slide to help you to study. And as you're studying for the quiz, for example, chapter 1 is on the first quiz. This will kind of help you consolidate your notes.